Prologue, the world before the fire. In the years before the war, the world felt like it was moving forward faster than it ever had. Cities were growing upward, factories were growing outward, railroads stitched nations together like tight seams, telegraph wires crossed oceans, newspapers were printed in the millions. A man could wake up in one country and by night sleep in another. He could read about a crisis happening hundreds of miles away, then watch his government respond before the next sunrise. To many people, it felt like the old days of kings and cavalry were fading. But in the quiet corners of Europe and the industrial heart of the world, another truth was rising. Modern life didn't make war impossible. It made war bigger. Bigger armies, bigger guns, bigger factories, bigger deaths. And by 1914, Europe was like a room full of men holding loaded rifles, each convinced the other would fire first. All it needed was one spark. Chapter 1, the shot that traveled across the world. The city was bright that morning, and the streets were packed. The Archduke's car moved slowly, like a ceremonial parade float. He sat upright, wearing the confident expression of a man who believed the world still obeyed old rules. There had been warnings. There had been rumors. There had been threats. But leaders had lived with threats for centuries. In 1914, many of them still believed their position made them untouchable, protected by tradition, uniforms, and the invisible wall of political importance. Then the shot cracked through the air. It wasn't just a gunshot, it was a signal. A young man standing among the crowd fired twice. The sound was sharp and sudden, like a hammer striking a bell. In seconds, the Archduke slumped. His blood darkened his uniform. His wife fell beside him. People screamed, horses panicked, guards shouted. The car sped away. And somewhere far beyond the city, beyond the mountains, beyond the borders, men in government offices began to realize something terrifying. This was not going to be contained. Not this time. Chapter 2, the domino room. In the weeks after the assassination, Europe became a continent of telegrams. Messages flew between capitals like bullets. Diplomats spoke in polite phrases, while their generals sharpened knives. In one palace, men in uniform studied maps with fingers stained by cigar smoke. In another, ministers argued over alliances and pride. In another, a king stared at a letter and understood that history had placed a pistol against his head. The alliances were meant to prevent war. That was the lie everyone told themselves. The truth was darker. The alliances guaranteed war. Because once one nation moved, it pulled the next like a chain. A small conflict could not stay small. A regional crisis could not stay regional. A single assassination could not stay a single tragedy. It was like a room full of dominoes, stacked perfectly. And now the first one had fallen. Chapter 3, the March Orders. By late July, the orders began. Mobilization. It was a word that sounded clean, almost technical, like a machine turning on. But mobilization meant trains packed with soldiers. It meant horses dragged from farms. It meant factories switching from civilian goods to shells and rifles. It meant wives and mothers standing on platforms, holding back tears, while men in uniforms tried to look brave. In villages and towns across Europe, church bells rang, not for weddings, not for celebrations, but for war. Some crowds cheered, not because they loved death, but because they believed war would be quick. Many believed it would be over by Christmas. That was another lie. In reality, Europe was about to enter a slaughterhouse built with steel, science, and pride. And the doors were closing. Chapter 4, the plan that couldn't stop asterisk. One of the most dangerous things about the coming war was that once the machine started moving, it could not stop. Generals had spent years designing war plans. They were proud of them. They trusted them. They believed these plans were the difference between victory and disaster. And the most famous of these plans depended on speed. It depended on trains arriving at exact times. It depended on soldiers marching on exact schedules. It depended on supply lines staying unbroken. It depended on the idea that human beings could behave like clockwork. So when diplomats tried to slow the crisis, the generals argued back. If we delay, we lose. If we stop mobilization, we fall behind. If we hesitate, we die. In those days, leaders feared weakness more than they feared war. So they signed the orders. And the trains began to roll. Chapter 5, The Border Storm. When the first armies crossed borders, it felt almost unreal. The world had seen wars before, but not like this. Not millions of men moving at once. Not artillery trains stretching for miles. Not infantry columns, so long they disappeared into the horizon. The first clashes were sharp and violent. Rifle fire cracked in forests. Cavalry units charged and fell like broken waves against machine guns. Artillery shells burst like thunder. The men fighting in these first battles still carried old ideas of war. They believed bravery could overcome bullets. They believed bayonets could break lines. They believed a soldier's courage mattered more than the enemy's technology. Within weeks, they learned the truth. Courage still mattered, but courage alone could not stop a machine gun. Chapter 6, The Great Advance. In the early weeks, the war moved fast. One side launched a massive advance, trying to strike deep into enemy territory and win quickly. The armies moved through towns and fields like floods. Civilians watched in fear as soldiers marched past their homes. Some fled, some stayed, some waved flags, some hid. In the cities, people read newspapers with huge headlines. Victory. Advance. The enemy, RETRATS. But behind the headlines, the casualties were already enormous. Men were dying by the thousands in single days. The war was consuming bodies at a rate that shocked even experienced officers. Still, the advance continued. Still, the generals pushed. Because the logic of the plan demanded it. And in modern war, logic could be more deadly than hatred. Chapter 7, The Battle That Changed Everything. Then came the battle that stopped the world. It was fought near a river and a wide open plain. For days, armies collided like titans. Infantry charged. Artillery fired until barrels glowed. Machine guns cut down waves of men. Cavalry, once the symbol of glory, became a symbol of tragedy. The battlefield became a nightmare. Bodies piled in fields. The air smelled of blood and smoke. The ground shook from constant shelling. And then something strange happened. The advance stalled. Not because the attackers lacked courage. Not because the defenders lacked fear. But because both sides were exhausted. They had thrown everything into the fight. And neither could break the other. The battle ended without a clear victory. But it created something far more important. A line. A front. And once the line formed, the war changed shape. Chapter 8, The Earth Opens. Trench war begins. When soldiers began digging, they thought it would be temporary. A few days. A week. Just enough to protect themselves until the next push. But the trenches grew deeper. They grew longer. They connected into networks like underground cities. And soon, the front became a scar across the continent. A scar that would not heal. From the coast to the mountains, men lived in mud and fear. The trenches were not romantic. They were not heroic. They were not like the old paintings of war. They were holes in the earth filled with water, rats, lice, rotting food, rotting bodies, and the constant sound of artillery. Men slept in boots. They ate cold rations. They stared at the sky and prayed, because at any moment, death could fall from above. Chapter 9, The First Winter 1914. By late 1914, the war that was supposed to end quickly had become a frozen nightmare. Winter arrived. Snow fell on trenches. Mud turned to ice. Men's fingers cracked and bled from cold. Frostbite became as dangerous as bullets. Artillery still fired. Machine guns still rattled. Snipers still hunted. But the cold added a new enemy. In some sectors, soldiers on opposite sides could hear each other coughing at night. They could smell each other's cooking. They could hear each other crying. The front had become so close, so intimate, that war started to feel less like nations fighting and more like trapped men surviving. Then, in one of the strangest moments in military history, something happened that no general could have planned. Chapter 10, The Night the Guns Fell Silent. It began with a song. A soldier standing in a trench started singing a Christmas hymn. Across the no man's land, another voice answered. Then another. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Candles appeared. Small lights flickering in the darkness. Men stood up. Slowly. Cautiously. Hands raised. Some walked into the open, expecting to be shot. But no shots came. Instead, they met. In the middle of the battlefield, where bodies lay frozen beneath the snow. They shook hands. They traded cigarettes. They exchanged food. They showed pictures of wives and children. For a few hours, the war disappeared. The men remembered they were human. Then, as dawn approached, officers shouted orders. The truce ended. Men returned to their trenches. And the guns resumed. But the memory of that night stayed with them, because it proved something terrifying. The soldiers did not hate each other. The war was something larger than hate. It was a machine. And it was not finished. Chapter 11, 1915. The year the war became a factory. In 1915, the war entered a new stage. The generals realized the front could not be broken by simple charges. They realized the enemy's defenses were too strong. So they turned to industry. The war became a factory process. Step 1. Bombard the enemy with artillery for days. Step 2. Send infantry over the top. Step 3. Watch them die. Step 4. Repeat. Factories back home worked day and night. Women entered industrial jobs in huge numbers. Governments controlled economies. Railroads were scheduled for war. Even food became a weapon. In 1915, nations began to understand. This war would be won not just by armies, but by entire societies. The battlefield was only the front edge of a much larger conflict. Chapter 12, Poison in the Wind. Then the war crossed another line. A line that humanity had promised never to cross again. In one battle, soldiers noticed a strange fog drifting across the field. It was greenish. It moved slowly, hugging the ground. At first, men thought it was smoke. Then they started coughing. Then they started choking. Then they started screaming. Their lungs burned. Their eyes melted with pain. Men clawed at their throats trying to breathe. Some ran. Some collapsed. Some died in piles, their faces turned toward the sky. It was poison gas. A weapon designed not just to kill, but to terrorize. The wind carried it. The earth absorbed it. The war had invented a new kind of fear. After that day, no soldier could ever look at fog the same way again. Chapter 13, The Steel Rain. Artillery was always dangerous. But in 1915, it became the true king of death. Guns grew bigger. Shells grew heavier. Barrages grew longer. In some battles, the ground was hit so many times it looked like the surface of the moon. Trees were shredded. Villages were erased. Roads disappeared. Men described it as standing inside a storm of metal. You could not fight artillery. You could not charge artillery. You could only hide and pray it missed you. The shelling broke bodies, but it also broke minds. Soldiers began to suffer a condition doctors struggled to name. Shell shock. Men who could not stop shaking. Men who could not speak. Men who stared blankly as if their souls had been ripped out. The war was not only killing men. It was destroying what it meant to be a man. Chapter 14, The Iron Front expands asterisk. By late 1915, the war spread like fire. New fronts opened. New nations entered. New battles erupted. The conflict that began as a European crisis was now becoming a global storm. Ships carried soldiers across oceans. Colonial troops fought in foreign mud. Warships hunted each other at sea. The world's economy bent toward destruction. And in the trenches, the men understood something their leaders still refused to admit. There was no easy way out. Chapter 15, The First Generation of War Heroes. In every war there are heroes. But in this war, heroism was different. It wasn't about cavalry charges. It wasn't about waving flags. It was about survival. A hero might be a man who crawled through mud under machine gun fire to rescue a wounded friend. A hero might be a medic who carried dozens of bodies while shells exploded around him. A hero might be an officer who stayed calm while the world collapsed. But the most famous heroes of 1914-1915 were often the dead. Because in trench warfare, the brave were usually the first to climb out, and the first to be shot. Chapter 16, The New War Language. The war created new words, new slang, new meanings. Men spoke of no man's land as if it were a living creature. They spoke of going over the top like it was a ritual. They spoke of the wire like it was a monster waiting to catch them. They spoke of the big push like it was a prayer. And in letters home, many soldiers lied. They wrote that they were fine. They wrote that the food was good. They wrote that the war would end soon. Because how could you explain the truth? How could you describe mud that swallowed boots? How could you describe the smell of bodies that could not be buried? How could you describe the feeling of waiting for death every minute? Many could not. So they wrote lies. And the families at home believed them. Chapter 17, The First Signs of Cracks. By the end of 1915, cracks began to appear. Not in the trenches, but in the governments. The cost was rising. The dead were piling up. The public was beginning to ask questions. The war was no longer a glorious adventure. It was a grinding disaster. And yet, no leader could admit defeat. No leader could say, "We were wrong." Because in modern politics, pride could be as deadly as artillery. So the war continued. And the next year would be even worse. End of part 1. The guns are awake asterisk. By the time 1915 ended, the world had changed. Millions were dead or wounded. The front lines had barely moved. The old dream of a quick victory was gone. In its place was a new reality. A war of machines. A war of industry. a war that would not end until one side was completely broken. And somewhere in the trenches, a young soldier stared across the frozen no-man's land and whispered a sentence that would become the secret truth of the entire conflict. This war is never going to end. Chapter 1. The war becomes a routine asterisk. By the end of 1915, the war had stopped being a shocking event. It became routine. That may be the most frightening sentence in the entire history of modern conflict. Because the human mind can get used to almost anything. A man can get used to cold. He can get used to hunger. He can get used to fear. And by 1916, millions of men had gotten used to living inside the world's largest graveyard. They woke up in trenches that smelled like wet earth, sweat, and old death. They cleaned rifles that were already rusting. They ate rations that tasted like metal and salt. They waited for orders. Sometimes the order was to attack. Sometimes the order was to hold. Sometimes the order was to dig. Digging became a kind of religion. The trenches grew deeper. The tunnels grew longer. The dugouts grew wider. It wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a civilization of mud. And every day, the civilization demanded payment. Chapter 2. The machine of artillery. If you asked a soldier in 1916 what the war sounded like, he wouldn't say rifles. He wouldn't say shouting. He would say thunder, because the artillery never truly stopped. Sometimes it slowed, like distant storms. Sometimes it rose into a roar that shook teeth loose. But it was always there. A constant reminder that the sky itself had been turned into a weapon. By 1916, armies had learned a cruel truth. You could not break trenches with bravery. You could not break trenches with bayonets. You broke trenches with shells. So the war became a math problem. How many shells does it take to destroy a trench line? How many shells does it take to cut wire? How many shells does it take to collapse dugouts? How many shells does it take to make a man lose his mind? The answer, it turned out, was always more. Factories worked night and day. Railroads hauled ammunition nonstop. Men in offices tracked numbers like accountants. And on the front line, soldiers lived under a sky that rained steel. Chapter 3. Life in the trenches. The world shrinks. In the trenches, a man's world shrank to a few yards. A soldier might live for weeks without seeing more than the wall of dirt in front of him, the muddy floor beneath him, the gray sky above him. The trench itself was like a long wound carved into the earth. Water pooled in the bottom. Rats ran through the corners. Lice crawled in uniforms. Men scratched until their skin bled. Some soldiers said the lice were worse than bullets, because at least bullets were quick. The rats were everywhere. Big rats, bold rats, rats that ate scraps, rats that ate corpses, rats that ran across sleeping men like they owned the place. At night, the trench was a chorus of noises. The drip of water, the scuttle of rats, the distant boom of artillery, the occasional scream of a wounded man stuck in no man's land. And the smell, that was what soldiers remembered most. Mud, smoke, sweat, and the sweet, sickening scent of bodies that could not be recovered. Chapter 4. The new religion. Survival asterisk. In earlier wars, soldiers dreamed of glory. In 1916, soldiers dreamed of survival. They stopped talking about victory. They talked about small things. A hot cup of coffee, a dry pair of socks, a letter from home. In some units, men made superstitions. A certain coin in a pocket, a certain prayer whispered before a patrol. a certain way of stepping over a trench board. Because in a war where death could fall from the sky at random, people needed something, anything, to feel like they had control. Even if it was nonsense. Especially if it was nonsense. Chapter 5, the battle that became a word, Verdun. Then came the battle that turned into a word. A word that meant endurance, misery, madness. Verdun. In early 1916, a massive attack began against a fortress region. The strategy was brutal. Not to capture territory quickly, but to bleed the enemy. To force them to send men into a killing zone until their army collapsed from exhaustion. The generals behind the plan believed war could be won by turning human beings into numbers. And Verdun became the ultimate experiment. The artillery bombardment was so heavy that the ground itself changed shape. Forests vanished. Hills were flattened. Villages were erased until only broken stones remained. Soldiers described the landscape as dead. Not destroyed. Dead. Because even the earth seemed wounded. Men fought for tiny pieces of ground. A hill. A fort. A trench line. They fought and died, then another wave replaced them. The battle went on for months. It became a grinder. A meat grinder. And the name Verdun became a symbol. They shall not pass. But the cost was horrifying. Chapter 6, the road of the living dead. To keep Verdun alive, supplies and men had to be moved constantly. One road became famous. A lifeline. Trucks moved day and night. Men marched in endless lines. Ambulances carried the wounded back. The road never slept. Soldiers called it the road of life. But many men who traveled it felt like they were already dead. Because Verdun wasn't just a battle. It was a place where time stopped. Where days blended into explosions. Where men forgot what silence sounded like. Where soldiers could look at a friend in the morning and find his body by noon. Chapter 7, the Somme, the day the world stopped breathing. While Verdun was still burning, another offensive began. The Somme. It was meant to break the trench line. To finally achieve the breakthrough everyone dreamed about. The planners believed artillery could destroy enemy defenses. So they fired shells for days. Thousands of guns. Millions of shells. The ground shook for a week. Then on the morning of the attack, whistles blew. Men climbed ladders. They stepped out of trenches and walked forward in lines. Many were told to walk, not run. Because they were told the enemy was already dead. But the enemy was not dead. The artillery had not destroyed the machine guns. The wire was not cut. The bunkers were not crushed. When the infantry advanced, machine guns opened fire. It was like scythes cutting wheat. Men fell in rows. In some sectors, entire units were wiped out in minutes. The first day of the Somme became one of the bloodiest days in military history. And still the offensive continued. For months, the ground turned into mud and blood. The dead were so many that soldiers stopped counting. The Somme became a place where the war showed its true face. A war where modern technology could kill faster than the human mind could process. Chapter 8, the birth of the tank. But the Somme also produced something new. A machine that looked like a monster. A steel box on tracks. At first, soldiers didn't understand what they were seeing. The tanks moved slowly, clanking like giant insects. They crossed trenches. They crushed wire. They fired machine guns from armored sides. Many broke down. Many got stuck. They were unreliable. But they carried a message. The old rules were dying. If the trenches could not be broken by men, they would be broken by machines. The tank was not yet the king of the battlefield, but it was the first hint of a future where steel would replace flesh. Chapter 9, Air War. The sky becomes a battlefield. In 1914, planes were still new. In 1916, planes became weapons. At first, pilots flew for observation. They mapped trenches. They spotted artillery. They guided fire. But soon, pilots began shooting at each other. They mounted machine guns on planes. They invented tactics. They formed squadrons. The sky became a battlefield above the trenches. Pilots became celebrities. Aces. Men who fought in clean air while infantry fought in mud. But the air war was not romantic for long. Planes burned. Men fell from the sky. And the bombs began to drop. Not just on trenches. On towns. On civilians. The war was spreading upward and outward. There was no safe place anymore. Chapter 10, The War at Sea, The Invisible Knife. While trenches consumed men on land, the war at sea became a silent struggle. Warships hunted each other. Blockades strangled economies. But the most terrifying weapon was not a battleship. It was the submarine. A submarine could hide beneath the waves. It could strike without warning. It could send a ship to the bottom in minutes. And because submarines were hard to detect, they created fear everywhere. Every ship became a target. Every ocean crossing became a gamble. The sea, once a symbol of freedom, became a hunting ground. Chapter 11, The Home Front. The war eats everything. By 1916, the war wasn't just on the front lines. It was in the kitchens, in the factories, in the schools. Governments rationed food. Meat became scarce. Bread became smaller. Coal was controlled. People waited in long lines. Women replaced men in factories. Children collected scrap metal. Posters told people to save, to sacrifice, to endure. The war was eating everything. And in many homes, the greatest fear wasn't hunger. It was the telegram. The message that began with, "We regret to inform you." Families lived with that fear every day. Chapter 12, The Soldier's Chain. Something happened to the soldiers in 1916. They changed. Not in a heroic way. In a quiet way. Men who entered the war as boys became older than their fathers. They stopped believing in speeches. They stopped believing in flags. They stopped believing in promises. They believed only in the man next to them, the trench that protected them, the routine that kept them alive. Many soldiers still fought bravely, but their bravery was no longer fueled by excitement. It was fueled by duty, exhaustion, and survival. The war was carving away everything soft inside them. Chapter 13, Mutiny in the Mind. Even when armies didn't openly mutiny, something began to break. Inside minds, inside spirits, men began refusing to attack. Not because they were cowards, because they were empty, because they had seen too much, because they had marched into machine gun fire too many times. Some officers tried to punish them. Some governments tried to hide the truth. But the truth was unavoidable. A human being could only take so much. And the trenches were asking for more than any human being could give. Chapter 14, The Year Ends in Fire. By late 1916, the world had lost its innocence. The war had become a permanent disaster. Verdun had consumed hundreds of thousands. The Somme had become a graveyard. The trenches remained. The line barely moved. And yet the war was not slowing. It was expanding. The leaders still believed the next offensive would be the one that ended it. The soldiers no longer believed that. They believed the war would last forever. And as winter returned, the trenches filled with water and ice once again. The men stared into the darkness. They listened to artillery. They waited. And the war waited with them. End of part 2. The trenches eat men. 1916 was the year the war proved something terrifying. The trenches could not be conquered by courage. They could only be conquered by destruction. And destruction was what modern nations had learned to produce better than anything else. But the war still had more surprises. Because 1917 would not just be about battles. It would be about something even more dangerous. Collapse. Chapter 1, the year everything snaps. 1917 didn't arrive like a new year. It arrived like a crack in a dam. For 2.5 years, the war had been grinding, chewing through men, metal, and hope. Nations had survived by telling their people one story over and over. Hold on, victory is close. But by 1917, that story was rotting. Not because people stopped loving their country. Not because they stopped fearing the enemy. But because reality had become impossible to ignore. The war had not become smaller. It had become a permanent condition. Factories were exhausted. Farms were underworked. Railways were overused. Cities were hungry. And the soldiers, they were no longer just tired. They were hollow. 1917 was the year the war stopped being a contest of armies and became a contest of which society could collapse last. Chapter 2, the Winter of Hunger. The winter of 1916-1917 was brutal. Not just in the trenches. In the cities, in the homes, in the streets. In many places, coal was scarce. People burned furniture to stay warm. Bread was rationed. Meat became rare. Milk became a luxury. Children grew thin. Old men died quietly in cold apartments. And the newspapers still printed patriotic slogans. Still printed promises. Still printed victory headlines. But people were starting to laugh at them. Not because it was funny. Because laughter was the last weapon left to powerless citizens. Across Europe, anger simmered. The war was no longer a distant battle. It was inside people's stomachs. Chapter 3, the submarine gamble. At sea, one side decided to gamble. They believed the war could be won by starving the enemy. So they unleashed submarines without restraint. Ships were sunk. Cargo disappeared. Food and fuel became harder to find. The ocean became a graveyard of floating debris and drowning sailors. This strategy was deadly. But it carried a risk. Because sinking neutral ships meant dragging new nations into the war. And in 1917, that risk became reality. A great power across the ocean, wealthy, industrial, and furious, began to move. At first it was slow. Then it became unstoppable. The war had awakened a sleeping giant. And once awakened, it could not be put back to sleep. Chapter 4, the revolution that shook the front. But the greatest shock of 1917 did not come from the sea. It came from inside an empire that had been fighting, bleeding, and starving. An empire where soldiers marched barefoot, where rifles were scarce, where generals demanded attacks with no ammunition, where peasants were tired of dying for rulers who lived in palaces. The people snapped. First came protests. then strikes, then mutiny. Soldiers refused orders. Crowds filled streets. The government tried to hold on, but it was too late. The empire collapsed like a rotten tree, and the world watched in disbelief as revolution exploded. Not just a change of leaders, a total transformation, a new kind of politics, a new kind of fear, and the front lines felt it immediately. Because when an empire collapses, armies collapse with it. One entire side of the war suddenly became unstable. The balance shifted. The war, already huge, became unpredictable. Chapter 5 Mutiny. The soldiers say no. On another front, the soldiers snap too. Not all of them. Not everywhere. But enough. After yet another massive offensive, planned with confidence, launched with speeches, and executed with blood, the soldiers reached their limit. They had charged machine guns too many times. They had watched friends die for nothing too many times. They had seen maps change by inches, while cemeteries grew by miles. So they refused. Not in dramatic rebellion. In quiet refusal. They stayed in trenches. They defended. But they would not attack. They would not climb out into no man's land for another big push. The officers panicked. Governments panicked. Because this was the nightmare of every modern state. An army that still exists, but no longer obeys. The leaders responded with discipline, punishment, execution, but they also responded with something else. Reform, better food, more rest, rotations away from the front. Because they realized a terrifying truth. You can't threaten an exhausted man forever. Eventually, he stops caring. And when a man stops caring, fear no longer works. Chapter 6 The war becomes personal again. For years, the war had been a giant machine. Artillery trenches, wire. But in 1917, something changed. The war became personal again. Raids increased. Night patrols crawled into enemy lines. Small unit combat became common. Soldiers fought with knives, clubs, and grenades. The battlefield was no longer just a place of mass death. It was also a place of intimate violence. Men didn't just die from shells. They died face to face. And that changed soldiers in a different way. A shell could kill you without hate. A knife required a human decision. And those decisions haunted survivors long after the battle ended. Chapter 7 The New American Shadow. The arrival of American power was like a slow wave at first. Not an instant transformation. But the psychological impact was immediate. Because everyone understood what it meant. Fresh troops. Fresh money. Fresh factories. Fresh ships. While Europe was exhausted, America was just beginning. In 1917, American soldiers began training. They marched in new uniforms. They sang songs. They wrote letters home. Many were young. Many were naive. But they carried something that Europe had lost. Energy. The older armies looked at them with a strange mixture of hope and pity. Hope that they could help win the war. Pity because they had no idea what they were walking into. Chapter 8 1917 Secret Weapon. The Stormtroopers. As the war dragged on, one side began to innovate. Not with bigger guns, but with new tactics. They formed special units. Stormtroops. Men trained for speed and surprise. Instead of charging in massive waves, these soldiers moved in small groups. They avoided strong points. They slipped through weak spots. They attacked command posts. They caused chaos. They were fast. They were brutal. They were terrifying. For years, trench warfare had been predictable. Now suddenly it was. The front lines began to feel like they could break. And that possibility made every commander desperate. Because if the line broke, everything behind it would be exposed. Chapter 9, The Spring Offensive, The Last Gamble *. In early 1918, a massive offensive began. The largest gamble of the war. The planners knew time was running out. They knew American forces were growing. They knew their own nation was starving. So they decided to strike hard. Strike fast. Strike before the enemy could fully prepare. The assault hit like a storm. Storm troops infiltrated trenches. Artillery fired in sudden, concentrated bursts. Poison gas returned. The line cracked. For the first time in years, the war moved. Villages were captured. Roads were taken. Prisoners poured back. The offensive looked like victory. But the war had learned a cruel lesson. A breakthrough is not the same as a win. Because moving forward meant stretching supply lines. It meant exhaustion. It meant running out of men. And the defenders, though battered, refused to collapse. They fell back. They regrouped. They held. And as the offensive slowed, the attackers began to realize they had spent their last strength. Chapter 10, The 100 Days, The Hammer Falls. Then the counterattack began. It was not one battle. It was a continuous storm. For months the defenders, now reinforced, now reorganized, now fueled by new troops, pushed back. Artillery rolled forward. Tanks appeared in larger numbers. Planes strafed trenches. Infantry advanced behind creeping barrages. The battlefield became a moving disaster. The enemy's morale began to collapse. Not instantly, but steadily, like a building whose foundation has been destroyed. Soldiers began surrendering. Units retreated without orders. Officers lost control. The war machine that had looked unstoppable in 1914 now looked like a dying beast. And the men fighting on that side began to understand. This was the end. Chapter 11, The Home Front Breaks. In 1918, the home front finally snapped. Cities faced hunger. Workers faced exhaustion. Families faced grief. There were protests, strikes, rebellions. The government tried to keep order. But the war had drained everything. Even loyalty. Even fear. In ports, sailors mutinied. In streets, crowds demanded peace. In factories, workers refused to produce. And in palaces, leaders stared at reports and realized the war was no longer about winning. It was about surviving the collapse. Chapter 12, The Empire Falls. By late 1918, the empire that had started the war as a confident power was shaking. Its allies were collapsing. Its armies were retreating. Its people were starving. Its leadership was panicking. The old order, kings, generals, aristocrats, began to look like ghosts. And then the unthinkable happened. The ruler abdicated. The monarchy fell. The empire dissolved. A nation that had seemed permanent was suddenly gone. Like smoke. And in the chaos, a new government emerged, weak, frightened, desperate for peace. They asked for an armistice. They begged for an end. Because they understood something no general wanted to admit. The army could not fight anymore. The nation could not survive anymore. Chapter 13, The Armistice, Silence After Thunder. On a cold day in November 1918, the guns fell silent. Not slowly. Not gradually. Suddenly. For the first time in years, men heard birds. They heard wind. They heard their own breathing. Some soldiers cheered. Some cried. Some stared at the ground, unable to process it. Because after years of constant noise, silence felt unnatural. Like the world had died. In some trenches, men walked out and looked across no man's land. They saw the shattered trees, the broken wire, the bodies that still lay unburied. And they realized the war was over, but nothing was healed. Chapter 14, The War's True Legacy. 1918 ended the fighting, but it did not end the war's impact. Millions were dead. Millions were wounded. Entire regions were destroyed. Economies were shattered. Families were broken. And perhaps most dangerously, the world had learned how to kill on an industrial scale. That knowledge would not disappear. It would wait, like a loaded weapon. And in the years after the armistice, people tried to return to normal life. They tried to rebuild. They tried to forget. But the war had planted seeds. Seeds of anger. Seeds of revenge. Seeds of fear. And those seeds would grow. End of part 3. The world breaks open. 1917-1918 was the breaking point. The war shattered empires. It shattered armies. It shattered faith in the old world. And when the guns finally stopped, the world stood in silence, looking at the ruins. But the story was not finished. Because the final part of this history is not about battles alone. It is about what comes after. The deals, the betrayals, the broken promises, and the dangerous new world built on the ashes. Chapter 1, Peace that didn't feel like peace. When the guns went silent in late 1918, many people believed the nightmare was finally over. But peace did not arrive like sunlight after a storm. It arrived like a wounded man limping into a room. The cities were still hungry. The roads were still full of soldiers. The hospitals were still overflowing. The cemeteries were still growing. Millions of men returned home with missing limbs, shattered lungs, and haunted eyes. Many couldn't sleep. Some screamed in the night. Some sat quietly at tables, staring at nothing, while their families pretended not to notice. Because what could you say to a man who had lived for years inside the earth? And as the world tried to celebrate victory, it discovered something terrifying. The war had ended, but the violence had not. Chapter 2, The Map Room, where the world was rewritten. In grand buildings far from the trenches, the leaders of the victorious nations gathered. They came with suits, medals, flags, and speeches. They spoke of justice. They spoke of peace. They spoke of rebuilding. But behind the speeches was the real purpose of the meetings: to divide the world. The war had destroyed empires. Now the survivors wanted to shape what replaced them. The negotiations were not clean. They were not noble. They were not simple. They were a battle fought with paper instead of bullets. A battle where the weapon was the pen, and the casualties would be counted in future generations. Chapter 3, The Punishment Problem. One of the biggest questions was simple. What do you do with the defeated nation? Some leaders wanted forgiveness. They argued that a humiliated country would become dangerous. Others wanted punishment. They argued that the war had been so brutal, so unforgivable, that mercy would be an insult to the dead. In the end, punishment won. The defeated nation was blamed. Not partially, completely. They were forced to accept full responsibility. They were forced to pay massive reparations. They were forced to shrink their army. They were forced to surrender territory. And as these terms were written, the defeated nation's representatives sat in silence, because they knew something the victors didn't want to admit. This wasn't peace. This was a *****. And humiliation in human history rarely ends quietly. Chapter 4, The Birth of New Nations. While one nation was punished, others were born. Empires had collapsed like buildings hit by earthquakes. And from the rubble, new countries appeared. Borders were drawn with rulers. Lines were placed across maps. Ethnic groups were divided. Old rivals were forced together. Some regions celebrated their independence. Others immediately began fighting over it. The leaders in the conference rooms believed they were creating order. But many of the borders they drew were time bombs. Because a border is not just a line. It is a decision about who belongs, who doesn't, who has power, who is powerless. And those decisions create anger. Anger creates violence. Violence creates war. The ink was barely dry, and already the world was beginning to shake again. Chapter 5, The Forgotten War, Civil Conflict After the Armistice. Most people imagine 1918 as the end. But for millions, 1919 was worse. Because the war didn't end everywhere. It changed form. In the East, civil wars erupted. In cities, street battles broke out. In rural regions, armed groups fought for land, revenge, and ideology. Soldiers who had survived trench warfare now fought their own countrymen. Some fought for monarchies. Some fought for new republics. Some fought for revolutionary movements. Some fought for pure survival. It became a chaotic struggle where uniforms meant less than hatred. And the civilians, as always, suffered most. Chapter 6, The Red Storm and the Fear of Revolution. The revolution that had exploded during the war didn't stop when the war ended. It grew. It spread like fire through dry grass. Workers demanded rights. Soldiers demanded respect. The poor demanded food. The old elites demanded control. Governments across Europe panicked because they looked at their exhausted nations and saw something terrifying. People were no longer afraid of authority. They were afraid of hunger. And hunger is stronger than fear. In many countries, uprisings began. Some were crushed. Some succeeded. Some turned into long civil wars. And in the minds of leaders, a new fear replaced the old fear of enemy armies. The fear of their own people. Chapter 7, The Return of the Soldiers. Millions of soldiers returned home. And many returned as strangers. They had been trained to kill. They had been trained to obey. They had been trained to survive. Now they were told to become normal again. To work. To smile. To pretend the last 4 years hadn't happened. But the war had changed them. Many veterans couldn't find jobs. Factories were closing. Economies were unstable. Inflation rose. Food prices soared. In some places, veterans formed armed groups. Not because they wanted violence, but because violence was the only language they still understood. The war had ended, but the war had left behind men who were still carrying it inside them. Chapter 8, The Flu, The Silent Army. Then came the enemy no one could shoot. A pandemic. A flu so deadly it moved faster than armies. It swept through cities, through villages, through military camps, through ships, through hospitals already filled with wounded men. It killed young people in huge numbers. It killed strong people. It killed fast. And because the world was exhausted and broken, it couldn't respond effectively. Doctors were overwhelmed. Governments hid the truth. Newspapers downplayed it. But families watched loved ones die in days. For many, the flu felt like the war's final cruelty. As if the world had survived bullets, only to be taken by breath. Chapter 9, 1920, the war's last battle. By 1920, most people wanted one thing: stability. But stability was rare. In many places, the war's final battles were still happening. Not between great empires, but between ideologies, between movements, between neighbors. The fighting looked different. It wasn't trenches. It wasn't massive artillery lines. It was ambushes, street battles, train attacks, political assassinations, secret police raids, armed militias. The war had created a new kind of conflict. Not only wars between nations, but wars inside nations. And those wars were often uglier. Because when a nation fights itself, there is no foreign enemy to blame. Only guilt, only revenge, only pain. Chapter 10, The New Order, a world built on fear. By the end of 1920, the world looked completely different than it had in 1914. The old empires were gone. New nations existed. The economy was unstable. Millions were dead. Millions were displaced. And the leaders who promised a war to end all wars now stood in a world filled with new dangers. They created new organizations, new treaties, new alliances. They promised cooperation. They promised peace. But underneath the promises was a quiet truth. The war had not ended war. It had modernized it. The world now understood. Tanks work. Poison gas works. Submarines work. Bombing works. Propaganda works. Starvation works. Total war works. And once a society learns these lessons, it rarely forgets them. Chapter 11, The Seeds of the Next Fire. The most tragic part of the story is this. Many people in 1920 could already feel the future. They could sense something dark coming. The defeated nation was humiliated and angry. The victorious nations were exhausted and divided. New ideologies were spreading. Economies were fragile. Veterans were traumatized. Borders were unstable. The world had not healed. It had only stopped bleeding for a moment. The war had ended, yes, but the conditions that created war were still alive. And history has a cruel habit. When the conditions remain, the disaster returns. Chapter 12, The Iron Front Legacy. So what was the Iron Front? It was not just trenches. It was not just artillery. It was not just battles. It was the moment humanity stepped into a new era. The era of industrial killing. The era where war became a factory. The era where nations learned to mobilize entire populations for destruction. The era where technology outpaced morality. The men who survived the Iron Front carried its shadow for the rest of their lives. And the world that came after was built by people who had been shaped by that shadow. Epilogue, The Quiet Before the Next Storm. In the early 1920s, people tried to rebuild. They repaired roads. They rebuilt cities. They planted crops. They married. They had children. They held parades. They wrote books. They made movies. They tried to believe in a future. But in many hearts, there was a quiet fear that the world had changed too much, that human beings had learned too well how to destroy. that the next war would be even worse. And history, as we now know, proved them right.